Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to my 2021 deck collection. Today we're going to be taking a quick peek at all the tarot decks currently in my collection. While this is in no way an extensive review of these decks, we'll chat briefly about how I use each of these decks in my personal reading practice. To start things off, we're going to be looking at the tarot decks that I use in my personal practice for growth, healing, magic, and deep inner work. So the first deck that I want to mention is the Tarot de St. Croix, because as I've mentioned before, this deck kind of reflects my spiritual evolution. This deck really kind of relates to the way that I read the tarot and the way that I see the world, I think closer than probably any other deck that I have in my collection. I really love the depictions and I really love the meanings in all of these cards. So along those same lines, another deck that really kind of ties into my own personal ideology when it comes to my spiritual evolution is actually the Animals Divine Tarot. It is primarily an animal deck. There are animals in all of the minors. And for me, with its sort of gods and goddesses in the majors and the court cards, really kind of embodies how I see the spiritual world, as in it's all connected. So when it kind of comes down to tying into my own spiritual self, for me, the deck that really embodies that is the Mundane Tarot. It is kind of what I call my soul speaker. So I feel like this is the deck that I pull out when I want to know what my inner voice really wants me to hear in this moment. And I feel like this deck really kind of embodies that ethereal and yet earthy nature of how my soul likes to speak. So whereas the Mundane is kind of like my soul speaker, the Black Lily Tarot is kind of my inner truth teller. When I want to know what my inner voice is trying to get me to see, and most of the time it's I don't want to see it. And this deck makes me see it. This deck makes me acknowledge it. So another deck that kind of speaks from the inside for me is the Victorian Romantic Tarot. And for me, this is kind of a deck that speaks from the heart. So when I want to know what's going on within my own heart, really experiencing on a heart level, this is the deck that I go to. It's often one that I use in my full body check-in when I'm working with heart space. This is the deck that I tend to pull in that position. So another deck that really kind of taps into sort of inner self and heart space with a little bit of a magic twist for me is the Ophidia Rosa Tarot. For me, this deck kind of taps into my inner poet. It's kind of a deck that it expresses itself through my own words, if that makes sense. But I do mostly rely on my own sort of poetic inspiration or connection to this deck. So of course, the deck that I feel that most connects with me on just an overall personal level is the Llewellyn Tarot. I guess you could call it a soul deck. It's a forever deck. It's the deck that feels the most connected to me on a personal level. I feel like this deck really expresses my inner landscape, and it's the deck that I use most often to connect with myself in just a kind of overall way. So also kind of tapping into that overall self is the Morgan Greer. Now this is a newer deck in my collection and one I just discovered toward the end of 2020. For me, this deck kind of represents my childhood. This feels like a deck of old friends to me, people who have known me forever and kind of always have my back. They're always there for me. And of course, I also have it in the tin. That's how much I love it. Next up, we have the Green Witch Tarot. It is definitely more earthy based. It's definitely seasonal. For me, it's just a deck that ties a little bit more closely into how my magical practice kind of has evolved and grown and changed over the years and where I've kind of come to at this point in my life. Whereas the Morgan Greer feels like a deck of kind of old family friends, this deck deck to me feels like a deck of witchy friends. And the last deck in this collection is the Efflorescent Tarot. I absolutely love this deck because for me, this is the deck of tapping into my emotional landscape. When I don't really know what's going on with me emotionally, this is the deck that I turn to. And it's very moody, but I find that it actually works quite balanced and quite well for emotional understanding in general. For me, this is a key deck for that kind of work. The first deck in this collection is the Ember and Aura Tarot. Now this is an indie deck. It is the Awakening edition. However, I have trimmed the gilding off of it, so it does normally come gilded. I love the soft pastel color palette of this deck. And for me, this deck definitely is a deck for nurturing, for support, and for healing. I often use it for my self-care readings. I also often use it for my full moon work. So another deck that I find to be really healing and nurturing is the Kai Tarot. This is a deck that I often use for kind of meditative work as well. I find that the abstract nature of it works really well for that. I really love the depictions. This is a deck that I can kind of just sink into, a deck that really does kind of make me stop and think. It's a bit of a meditative deck for me, but I also find it has a really wonderful soothing and nurturing energy to it. Next, we have the Spirit Song Tarot. I have modified my version. I've trimmed it down, taken some of the borders off and edged it, which helped make it a little bit smaller and a little bit easier for me to contend with. This is a deck that I go to more for spiritual connection and spiritual nurturing. And so while it is, of course, an animal deck, for me, it serves much more of a purpose of nurturing and connecting to spirit. So another animal deck that I find to be very supportive, but more than that, actually meditative for me. This is the Forager's Daughter Tarot. And I find that while this is a nurturing and supportive deck, for me, it is more of a deck of reminding me to slow down, to really take some time to reflect, to meditate, and to think about the messages that I'm receiving. So one of the decks that I have used primarily for healing is the Tarot of Transformation. Now this is a wonderfully supportive and nurturing deck, but for me, it's also very much a deck of healing. I want to say in 2018, I was kind of going through a rough time myself, and I found that this deck was really key into helping me work through some of the things that I had going on in my life. So for me, that was definitely a key deck in terms of any sort of healing work that I'm doing. Next up, we have the Paulina Tarot. For me, this deck kind of represents what spring feels like here in the Pacific Northwest. It's a little bit gloomy. It could totally just be my own personal thing because of where I live and my association to this deck. But for me, this is a deck that reminds me that even when life is kind of gray and dull and overcast, there is going to be rebirth and spring because the wheel continues to turn. This is the Art of Love Tarot. I do believe this deck has been re-released with a new name, and I find that for this deck, I really don't pay a whole lot of attention to the tarot associations. What I key into is actually the keywords on the bottom because I think that they are just fantastic. I really enjoy working with this deck, reading with this deck. It's one that's surprised me, to be completely honest. I didn't expect to really like it or connect with it as much as I do. So another tarot deck that I read like an oracle is the Guardian Angel Tarot. This is one that I often pull when I just kind of need a reassuring message. It's definitely a supportive and nurturing deck. For me, I call it my grandma deck. Like it feels like having a conversation with my grandmother, just really tapping into that everything's gonna be okay energy, which is really quite wonderful. I think we all need a grandma deck in our lives. So a little pocket tarot that I often turn to is the Mesquite Tarot. This deck is absolutely wonderful. It's so loving and soft and supportive, and I just really adore the simple imagery. This is also a deck that I use a lot for kind of quiet moments and meditation, just pulling a card to really sit with the image and think about the message and let it kind of just create this wonderful quiet moment within me. So another little pocket deck that I absolutely adore working with is the White Sage Tarot. And this is a deck that I use all the time for meditation, for mindfulness, and just for kind of getting those supportive in the moment messages. It does feel like a deck that is kind of stripped away of a lot of the esoterica. And so for me, that works really well for a healing and nurturing deck. We're going to start off with the deck that I use for inner child work, and this is the Nicoletta. For me, this deck represents sort of the inner child or the wounded child, and it works beautifully for that. It's definitely what some people would probably call some shadow work. I find this deck to be extremely powerful. I love working with it in that sense. I definitely use it to connect into the kind of child within, that inner space, and a lot of it is deep healing work. So another key deck that I use for kind of deep inner work, or what others might call shadow work, is the Mary L Tarot. This is the first edition. I do have 2 copies of this deck because I have this edition, then I have another edition that is completely trimmed down just to the artwork. How I work with this deck is probably what most people would consider shadow work, or that really deep inner work of discovering self and soul and connection. So another one of my favorite decks to use for deep inner work is the Esoteric Tarot. This deck I absolutely adore. It feels very much like a deck that helps me to kind of navigate the balance between the magical and the mundane. My inner self and my magical self and my outer self, if that makes sense. And for me, this deck kind of encapsulates that walking between those two worlds. So another deck that I use for deep inner work is the Stunning Tarot. Now this is a deck that I actually kind of use almost like a personal power deck. It's one that I tend to draw to when I want to discover that deep internal power. And I feel like that deep internal power almost has a little bit of an ancestral link to it. And I definitely feel that the artwork in this card really connects into that. The main deck that I also use for my dark moon readings is the Dark Goddess Tarot. This is the indie edition. I often pull one of these cards as a dark goddess to work with during the dark moon, and I often pair it with other tarot decks to further expand upon that message. This is one of my favorite decks in terms of a goddess deck. I love the artwork. It is by Ellen Lorenzi Prince, and I think I have most of her decks now at this point. So in keeping with our Ellen Lorenzi Prince and Dark Goddess energy, we have the Tarot of the Crone. And it's now the deck that I use primarily in my goddess work with Hecate. And so it's definitely a deep dive deck for me, deep inner work deck, but for me really tied into that particular deity and that particular practice. On the full moon, I work with Mother Mary, and my primary deck for that is the Mysteries of Mary Tarot. That is a really hard moon phase for me every single month. And so it's really helpful for me to have Mother Mary there as kind of like my guiding force, my guiding energy during that time. This is definitely one of the key decks that I work with for my deep work with Mary, as well as one of my key decks that I work with for the full moon. Now let's take a peek at the tarot decks that I use to help me explore the larger energies of the world, where we came from, and how we connect. So one of the decks that is the newest in my collection that falls into this category is the Ad Orbita Tarot. And one of the things that I really love about this deck is, as it says on the box, from the soil to the stars. And it really does tie in that connection of the greater cosmic energy with the here in the mundane earthy energy. And I think it just works really beautiful for that. I love the artwork. I love the cardstock, and it's just a fantastic deck. So next we have my oldest and probably most favorite cosmic deck, and that is the Star Tarot. Now this is the first edition, which I have trimmed. I absolutely love this deck. It is a deck that I think really does, again, bridge that gap between above and below really beautifully. It's very cosmic, very ethereal, but it's also very grounded in the earth, which I really do appreciate. And it's definitely one of the favorites in my collection. So another deck in my collection that has a kind of similar feel is the Spiral Tarot. One of the things that I really love about this deck is we have that kind of greater cosmic energy in the majors with the more mundane in the minors. And I really like that interpretation of dividing the arcanas up that way and depicting them in a way that really matches that. That's kind of the charm and the beauty of this deck, is it does bring both of those elements together into one deck, and it's really quite beautiful. We have, of course, the Moonchild Tarot, which probably needs no introduction on my channel. I adore this deck. It's one that surprised me. This one feels like it kind of is the starseed energy come to earth. It's a beautiful reader, and I really enjoy the messages that I get from it. It's often a deck that I use also at the full moon, because I really kind of need that grounding deep into that nurturing energy, and this deck does that beautifully for me. And of course, as I mentioned, on the flip side of that, we have the Starchild Tarot, also by the same creator. This is the first edition reprint. It's kind of the starseed balance to the Moonchild. I mean, not every image 100% connects with me, but overall, I really enjoy the messages that I get from this deck. I do find it to be quite nurturing and very supportive, but I love that it brings that sort of cosmic energy into my hands, into this deck. And finally, the last deck in our cosmic collection is the Wild Messengers Alchemical Tarot. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest, I've yet to use this deck, and I wasn't really sure where to put it, but the artwork is very cosmic, and we have kind of that cosmic animal energy going on. And so I decided to put it here just because I feel like it looks like it belongs here, but again, I haven't used it to really tell you for sure. We start with the Tarot of the Trees. This is the new 10th edition, which has the matte cardstock, and it's big and beautiful. I did completely take the borders off this deck, and I did edge it. But I've had the little edition of this for quite some time, and that's the one that the kids always go to when we go camping. And so I bought the larger version for me so that I could have one that's trimmed down. I love the big, beautiful size of it. So another sort of nature-based deck, and this one does have quite a few animals in it as well, is the Spacious Tarot. I quite enjoy this deck. We're moving a little bit more away from the traditional RWS and going into more of a numerological and elemental reflection of the tarot. I really love the nature energy that comes through this deck. More spacious, as it says. And it's a deck that I really enjoy working with. The next deck is the Wild Unknown. I really do like this deck. It's taken me a really long time to actually come around to working with, and I don't want to say appreciate, because I've always appreciated the art on this deck and what this deck did in the tarot community, but it's taken me a while to make a personal connection with it. I had to really work at it. It is kind of stripped of a lot of the esoterica, which sometimes is really, really nice. So I enjoy working with it in that sense. The next deck is the Herb Crafter's Tarot. I am kind of intending to use it more as a study deck to become a little bit more familiar with herb crafting. I really, really love the artwork. I think it's absolutely beautiful, and I hear the guidebook is amazing. As you can see, it's still in order, so I haven't had a chance to actually work with it yet, but I'm really excited to dive into it. I'm hoping maybe this spring this will be one that I can really get to know. So one of the newer nature and animal-based decks in my collection is the Oak, Ash, and Thorn. This deck does offer something a little bit different than the rest of my animal decks. I don't know that I've quite put my finger on it because I haven't really worked with it yet. I did get a reading from Kelly at The Truth and Story, and she used this deck. And after that, I just knew that I had to have it, had to bring it into my collection. Now, generally the Pentacles is my suit, but in this deck, it is definitely all about those beautiful wands for me. And the newest nature-based and animal-heavy deck that I have in my collection is the Gentle Tarot. And this is a deck that I've just really started to do some work with. I really appreciate the artwork in this deck, the diversity in this deck. I love the integration between the natural realm and the human realm. It really does pull in that idea that we are all connected, we are all one. So the first deck in our sort of historic and or Marseille style decks is the Golden Tarot. This is the Mary Packard version based on the Visconti Forza deck. I absolutely adore the majors and the court cards in this deck. I think they're absolutely fantastic. I really, really enjoy looking at them. I have considered just pulling out the courts and the majors to use them as a sort of majors only plus courts deck. So one of the Tarot de Marseilles that I have is probably what I would consider the closest to like an original Marseille is the Mary Packard version. I'm actually not going to open it because it is still wrapped in plastic. I do believe it is out of print because I am going to do a project with it, not using the actual cards themselves, but I'm going to scan them in and do a paper project with it. But it is the only true Tarot de Marseille that I have in my collection. So a couple of my favorite Marseille style decks. This one is the Tarot de Maria Celia. This is a little tarot in the tin. This deck is so cute and I love the color palette. It's not entirely traditional, I think mostly because of the art style and the colors. I really am not an expert on Marseille. I do not read Marseille very often. It's one that because I think it's little and pocket sized and in a tin, I do tend to throw it in my bag and take it places with me. So another one of my favorite Marseille style decks is the Tarot de Ozarks, and this is the second edition, which has a different back on it. The fronts are totally the same as the first, and I, yes, totally purchased a copy of the second edition just to get those backs because I think they're kind of amazing and so much better than those Christmas card backs they had before. This deck is fantastic. I love the color palette. I love the art style of it. So another kind of historic inspired deck, because I do not believe that this is a historical deck, is the La Cour des Tarioki. It's this wonderful, it's one of those El Meningalo decks, and it has the like old style like linen paper. I just think it is just the most adorable little thing. I love the characters that we see in the majors and the court cards are just fantastic. But I do also enjoy the illustrations and the minors as well. This is the Byzantine Tarot, and I purchased this after watching Renee from Meadowlark Mystic talk about this deck. But I'm going to show you the card that sold me. That one right there. I had to have it because of this one card. This one card. I love the artwork in this deck. It is an interesting deck. I have not had a chance to do any readings with it. I've only just looked through it. As you can see, it is still in order. I really like the illustrations. I think they're really cool. Here we have the Manuscript of Initiations Tarot. It is basically based on the idea of illuminated text, so it had a bit of a sort of historic feel to me. I love the artwork in this deck. The cardstock is a shame. It's basically paper. And I bought it specifically because it was the thin one, because I'm actually going to use it in a paper crafting project. And when I do that, the thinner cards actually work better for that because I end up, layering over the top of it. Here we have the Golden Tarot, and this is the cat black version. I have totally trimmed this deck down and made it kind of pocket sized. I adore the artwork in this deck. I really do like Cat Black's artwork, even though I know I passed on one of her decks, but it's because I have this one. For really lack of a better term, I'm just going to call these all Renaissance style because I'm not that versed in historic artwork, but they do kind of all have the same sort of energy and feeling for me. So the next deck is the Influence of Angels Tarot. Now this one is by a different artist, but it has a similar feel to me as the Golden Tarot does. I absolutely love this deck. I love where trying to find where the angels are to see what they're whispering, because there is an angel in every card, and I think that's really fantastic. Sometimes they're just kind of hanging out around people, and sometimes they are the central figure in the cards, which I think is quite lovely. So another deck that has that same sort of Renaissance painting feel is the Majestic Earth Tarot. This one is, of course, a beautiful deck that has primarily landscape paintings, and it's just a fantastically curated deck, and it's beautiful. But you see they all have kind of the same sort of style, and kind of feels like the same period to me. I don't know whether they are or not, to be perfectly honest with you, but they have the same kind of color palette, feel, and style. So in the opposite end of that, here we have the Tildwick Tarot, and this one feels like it is more about the inner world, the inner landscape. I use this deck quite often for meditation. I find it to be a beautiful deck to really just kind of sink into these images, immerse yourself into this world. It doesn't have like a dreamy otherworldly quality to it. It feels like a real place that probably existed or could exist. So another deck filled with absolutely fantastic artwork is the Revival Art Tarot. This deck is, it was a surprise for me. I knew I liked this artwork, and I knew I liked the art style. This High Priestess is just amazing. I think she's gorgeous. She feels like a real world High Priestess to me, which is I think what I really love about her. The artwork is absolutely beautiful, and I love it so much I bought the Lenormand as well, which we will see when we talk about that collection of decks. So another deck with some beautiful artwork in it is the Mystic Masters. I adore Danny's deck. I love the art pieces that she chose. I love the collage, the embellishments, and all of the additions that she added to each card. They are all very thoughtful, and they all add to the artwork. It really is a collaborative effort between Danny and these Mystic Masters, which is just absolutely wonderful. So another deck that has some really fantastic Renaissance-y flavored artwork is the Hudes Tarot. Now this one is sadly out of print. I absolutely love this deck. It's a deck that came to me at a time when I was very ill. Being able to kind of immerse myself in this deck during that time had just really helped facilitate my healing. I think more than anything, just to give me something else to focus on. I have a really special place in my heart for this deck because it came to me at that time. And this is the Anna K Tarot. This deck is pretty much devoid of all the esoterica and really just kind of focuses on the mundane of everyday life. I definitely could have put this deck into my personal practice decks because it is one that I use for that. Primary job is family readings. That's not its only job, and I do use it for other readings, so I didn't want to like really pigeonhole it into anything. And I love it so much and use it so often with my trimmed Llewellyn that I actually have a second copy that I have trimmed down to just the artwork. And finally, we have another deck that does it really belong here? Probably not, but this is where it's going. And that is, of course, the Smith-Waite Centennial. This is really the only true Rider-Waite-Smith deck that I own. I'm not a huge fan of the RWS artwork in general, but of all of them, this one is my favorite. Again, it's another one that I have 2 copies of because I also have the copy in a tin, which is fantastic. So the first deck that we're going to take a look at in my sort of Celtic pagan decks is, of course, the Druidcraft Tarot, and I am in the process of repainting it. I'm not changing any of the artwork, I'm just adding layers of pearlescent paint. I don't know if it'll show up on camera. I think I tried this with other decks as well, and it doesn't work. It's one that I love. It's kind of like, as we call it, the workhorse deck. Like you can pull it out for anything and do any sort of reading, and I never struggle with the messages. So, and of course, along those same lines, we also have the Wildwood Tarot. I've purchased a couple of the extra books to go along with this deck because I am interested in exploring it more. And this one is in order because this is a newer copy that I traded for because I ruined my first copy trying to modify it. This deck does kind of go its own way, and so I'm looking forward to really kind of dive into the structure as it was meant to be and explore it in that way as well. Of course, the Pagan Otherworlds, another fantastic kind of Celtic, Druidy, pagan-y type of deck. This one has, absolutely stunning artwork, and I really enjoy working with it. Again, it's another workhorse deck, a really solid reader. I don't really have any issue working with this deck in terms of reading with it. I do have trouble working with it in terms of its size and its kind of slippiness. I know everybody covets this cardstock, but it kind of runs away on me, to be perfectly honest. Next up, we have the Vision Quest Tarot. This is a beautiful deck. I really enjoy the artwork and the imagery. I really enjoy working with it. It's a little bit pippy in terms of the minors, so we don't always have like a full scene illustrated, but I really do enjoy it. It also has some interesting keywords, and I'm not usually a fan of keywords on decks, but I do quite like it in this deck, and I do think that they work rather well. Next up, we have the Minoan Tarot. This is another Ellen Lorenzi Prince deck, and I really dig her art style. It's a little bit on the primal side, which I think is really cool. I really enjoy the color palette in this deck. The guidebook is fantastic, and I almost always reference the guidebook when working with this deck. I do quite enjoy working with it, and it's been one that it's been really fun to explore and to get to know. The next deck is the Shining Tribe Tarot, and again, it has that primitive art style. I do still have this one in order because I am planning on doing a deep dive with it, but I'm really interested in exploring this deck in terms of its guidebook and its structure. A lot of the deck has been renamed, and so I'm really interested to see how it works out. We had rivers, and now we have birds, and we have stones, and I might have missed one already. So another newer deck in my collection that again has a bit of that ancestral feel to me is the Hoodoo Tarot. Now I haven't had a chance to work with this one very much, but the artwork. Love the artwork. It's amazing. I'm really excited to dive into this one more, to get to know the stories. I hear that I've seen that the guidebook is pretty in-depth and there's a lot of stories in it. So I'm really, really excited to dive into those. This is the Mythic Tarot, the 1986, out of print edition. And while this deck does have a very storybook quality based on myth and legend and story, I actually put it here because I feel like it does kind of connect to ancestral energy of that time, because myth and story was a key part of the culture and of the history and the actual everyday living world. So along those same lines, we have the Goddess Tarot. This deck to me, even though it's definitely a goddess deck, there's no two ways about that, it does follow goddesses from certain cultures. And so I feel that in this sense, this is how it connects in a sort of ancestral way, because it connects the goddesses and their stories and their cultures to the tarot. And I think that that's really interesting. I really enjoy the artwork in this deck. And finally, let's take a look at the decks that I use to help me explore the magical as well as the mundane. The first deck in this collection is the Sacerdotito Tarot, and this is of course a beautiful modern deck. I love the artwork, I love the imagery. I love that we also have a kind of variety of ages in this deck, which is not something that we normally see. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful deck, really thoughtfully created. And it's just one that I really enjoy working with, particularly when I'm looking to kind of pull in that more modern and diverse energy. I think this one works great for that. So another modern collage deck that I really enjoy is the Muse Tarot, and this is the mass market edition. And I use this deck, even though it is a tarot, I don't really use it like a tarot, I use it more like an oracle. And this is a deck that I use for creative inspiration. When I'm feeling kind of creatively blocked, or I just need something to kind of kickstart my creativity, this is often the deck that I go to. I really enjoy working with it in that way. So another collage deck is the Textured Tarot. This one has an interesting kind of variety of textures, obviously, judging by the name. It does have some diversity in it, which is really beautiful. And it's done very well. I really enjoy working with it, with the exception of the cardstock. It does have that cardboard cardstock. I forget what it's called. It's like a sustainable product, I do believe, which is really fantastic. However, you cannot riffle shuffle this deck. Oh, this deck. It is so stinking cute. This is the Coffee Tarot. I really love the artwork. It's just because I love coffee and I love that this is a coffee themed deck. It's charming. I'm not fond of the quartz, and that's one of the issues that I have with this. It makes me smile every time I look at it, and so I just need to keep it, and I just need to modify it a little bit so that it's a little bit smaller, easier for me to work with, because I do just really enjoy the artwork of it. So moving back into our collage decks, we have our tarot. But the thing I really love about this deck is the use of historic women. So every card features a notable woman from history, but I put it in here in my modern category because of the style of the deck. It is created in a modern collage style. And so that's why it ended up here, but I do quite love it. But I do wish the images were bigger and the white space in text was quite a bit smaller. So the last tarot deck we have in this collection, this is the Housewives Tarot. I love that it comes in this little recipe box. I put it in my modern collection because it's modern but retro, right? I mean, it's modern when we compare it to a deck that represents, the 1800s, or we go back to Egyptian times. I love this deck. It has a really quirky, fantastic little energy to it. So to start us off in my magical collection, we have my Modern Spellcasters Tarot. I think this deck has the most unfortunate name because it's a fantastic deck, but it is in no way modern. It has a bit of a masculine feel to me, which is one of the reasons why I really enjoy it. And I think the artwork is stunning. The guidebook is a little unfortunate because there is a lot of symbols and things like runes in these cards that the guidebook really doesn't go into, but it's a fantastic deck and I really enjoy working with it. So whereas that one feels like people magic, the Tarot of the Hidden Realms feels like fae magic to me. I think it's an absolutely beautiful deck. I love the artwork, but one of the things that I really like the most about this deck is the up close and personal perspective that we get on these particular cards and working with these characters. They do feel very much fae, and as I've mentioned before, it feels like diving beneath the brambles and coming out the other side into this magical world of the fae or the fairy. So another deck is the Tarot of the She. I absolutely love this deck. To me, this is a power deck, and it's definitely one that I feel like pulling a card from this deck will allow me to tap into the she energy and to really pull it out in a very powerful and almost explosive kind of way. I really dig the raw kind of primal art style of this deck. I feel like it fits the energy of the she really well. So another deck that I feel like is slipping beneath the brambles is the Tower of the Secret Forest. One of the things that I really enjoy about this deck is the fact that the images are on the back. To me, these feel like the primal aspects of each of the cards. So we have kind of like the evolved aspect on the front and the primal or underlying or shadow energy on the back side. So depending on which side comes up in the reading will depend on how I work with it. So along the same line is the Fairy Lights Tarot. Now this one does have backs to it, so it doesn't reverse like the Tarot of the Secret Forest does, but the artwork is by the same artist. And I see this one as being the sort of lighter counterpart to the deck we just looked at. I love the artwork. It's very powerful. I feel like this deck is showing us what is coming into the light, what is being illuminated. And so I often work with them together because I think they read beautifully together. The newest magical or witchy type deck in my collection is the Witch's Wisdom Tarot. As we all know, it does take a different approach to the tarot. This is basically looking at the tarot in a reversed order rather than ascending to the Father's heaven. It's about going deep into the mother's womb. And I do really like that it takes much more of a numerological and elemental approach to the minors, which is really a lot more in line with how I read. So shifting from a little bit of the kind of broad-based magical to the more esoteric, the first being the Tabula Mundi. Most of these decks, with the exception of one, I think, are actually fairly Thoth-based. I am hoping to do a deep dive study with this. I love the artwork in the Tabula Mundi. It was kind of the deck that drew me to wanting to work with the Thoth system and to learn more about it. So I'm excited to dive into that one. Next up, we have the Tarot of the Spirit. I do believe that it is more Thoth-based, or as I sometimes say, it's a little bit Thothier. I don't know that it's 100% based on Thoth because, again, I have not read with it. I have not dove into the guidebooks. I just have the cards and the big, beautiful book that goes along with it. I have heard that this is kind of a wonderful sort of gateway deck. Start into your journey with the Thoth Tarot. And of course, for studying the Thoth, I should probably have an actual Thoth deck. So this is just the small, newer mass market edition. There's nothing special about this deck. I just picked it up in order to have this to be able to reference what the original artwork looked like. And I thought that might be interesting, kind of, you know, like we do with the RWS. That is why I got the Thoth Tarot and why it's still a part of my collection, because it is a reference deck for me. And my last sort of heavily esoteric deck is the Tarot of the Holy Light. This deck is interesting. I'm completely fascinated by it. The artwork isn't really my style, but what started me on the journey with this deck was that I read the guidebook, the bigger book that goes with it. And so I decided to go ahead and get the cards themselves so that I could study it more in depth. So the first deck in this collection is the Hush Tarot, and this is a newer deck, of course, in my collection, newer as of last year, and I've done a few videos on this deck. I'm really enjoying working with it. To me, this deck embodies life and death. It really does showcase the delicate balance between the two, and I think it just really does it beautifully, and I'm really enjoying looking at the tarot through its unique lens. So another deck that kind of taps into that sort of shadowy aspect of life for me is the Darkness of Light Tarot. Now, while this deck is not necessarily like a darker Gothic deck, it definitely has a darker feel to me. It feels a little bit like it looks at the darker side of each card because of the color palette and the beautiful, dark, muted, kind of Gothic-y undertones. I feel like it reads a little bit that way. So a deck that looks at it through a more humorous or comical lens is the Zombie Tarot. It's a very lighthearted deck on the one hand, but it doesn't shy away from those little bit harder aspects as well. I love the integration of the zombies with these 1950s characters. I think it's just absolutely fantastic. It's a lot of fun, but it reads really beautifully and actually reads really balanced. So another deck we'll look at the shadow aspects of self and humanity is the Bohemian Gothic Tarot. I love the play of light and dark in this deck, and it is a fun deck. It doesn't take itself too terribly seriously. It has one of my favorite world cards, and that's kind of the card that really sold me on this deck. So I do really appreciate it for its ability to kind of walk both sides of that line there. So another deck that I really love is the Antique Anatomy Tarot. Now this is the mass market edition, but as you can see here, I have completely modified this deck. It was a wonderful experience, and it has a really great energy to it. It really encapsulates the balance between life and death in a really beautiful way. So I do also have the indie edition of this deck. We have all the skulls and the bones, but we also have all the florals and botanicals in this that reminds us that there is life after death. And the last deck in this collection is the Madame Lydia Wilhelmina's Tarot. This is kind of entering a weird sort of Renaissance, strange world that's like just completely odd and left of center. It does have a very dark and gothic vibe to it, of course, as we can see here in this imagery. And the characters in it are quite interesting. And it does encourage me to look at this style of artwork from a different perspective. To start this collection out, we're going to take a look at what I think is probably my most surreal deck, and that is the Wooden Tarot. But the thing I love about this deck is it does allow me to read very numerological and elemental. It has a very balanced imagery to it. And I love that this deck is weird and quirky, but more importantly, it does make me stop and think. It allows me to really open up my reading style and encourages me to look at things from a different perspective. Up next is the Dreamkeeper's Tarot. Now this is in the indie edition. It is available in mass market. It's kind of gothic, but it is more like stepping into a dreamscape or this strange, unusual, surreal world. And I really enjoy the artwork. We definitely see some traditional imagery, but it's just kind of different. So it's kind of just all that good strangeness rolled up into one. So another little deck that really taps into that idea of dreams is Tarot of a Lucid Slumber. I really enjoy the presentation of the minors and how they're put together. And it's just a kind of fascinating little weird deck. Again, taking you to a different place, a different world. You know, sometimes we're in this kind of almost pagan-y, earthy world, and sometimes we're in this water world. So it's really interesting. So next we have the Second Nature Tarot. This deck to me is like if the Forest of Enchantment and Tarot of a Mystical Moments had a baby. That's what this deck is. It's very kind of earthy and grounded, and yet it is full of these kind of strange, surreal images, and I just adore it. I think it's so much fun. I love the color palette. It's like stepping through the looking glass into a sort of pagan-y wonderland. And of course, speaking of the Tarot of Mystical Moments, so this is a deck that, oh my goodness, I love this artwork. Again, it is like stepping into that strange, surreal kind of world. This one has a very Victorian feel to it. It's very much a dreamscape type of world. I'm really looking forward to working with it. I haven't gotten a chance to really do any deep readings with it or anything yet. I've just really spent some time kind of looking through this beautiful imagery. So the next deck that we're going to take a look at is the Crystal Tarot. This is a little bit more of a traditional deck. It has this beautiful, almost like stained glass looking artwork, which, oh, I wish they would reprint this in a bigger version. But it is kind of like stepping into a different world. This deck feels to me like if you stepped through a stained glass window into an alternate reality. I feel like this is what you'd be stepping into. So next we have stepping into a really strange world with the Saki Saki Tarot. This deck has the most bizarre artwork, very strange, very surreal, almost kind of comic booky. And I have decided I like the artwork on this one the best. So this is the one that I'm keeping because I don't need a bunch of these decks. But I do really like having one deck with just really strange artwork that really makes me stop and think. Up next is the Yolanda Tarot. It does feel kind of like stepping into the pages of this sort of kind of grown-up comic booky storybook world. But it's weird. It's a weird little deck, and it definitely has strange imagery to it. And so I appreciate its weirdness. This is the one that had the giant purple borders around it, and I trimmed them all off. It is an out-of-print deck, and it can be kind of hard to get a hold of, but it's really cool and strange. So for the last tarot deck for my kind of dreamscape, otherworldly style decks is the Solera Occulti Tarot. This is the first edition and I have trimmed it down. I love the restrained color palette in this deck. It is just a fantastic use of color or limited use of color. I love the strange artwork, these weird little characters. This again is like stepping into some strange dream world. This deck really clicks for me. So we're going to start my storybook decks off with the ultimate storybook deck for me, and that is the Fairy Tale Tarot. This is the one by Lisa Hunt. This deck is fantastic. I love the imagery. I love the stories represented. Of course, I have the Spanish edition, so I can't read the guidebook, but I have the app on my phone, and so I just use that to access the English version of the guidebook. And again, I love the imagery. I love the fairy tales. And the other Fairy Tale Tarot in my collection is the Baba Studios deck, and this one was very generously gifted to me by my dear friend Lisa. I haven't read with it much because I'm kind of like, it feels a little bit precious, and so I haven't really done a ton of readings with it. I do really enjoy the stories and the artwork. This to me feels like actually looking through a storybook, looking through a book of fairy tales. So the next deck is the Forest of Enchantment. This deck is beautiful. I absolutely love the artwork. It is like walking into a storybook. It's like immersing yourself into this wonderful fairy tale world, and it's just beautiful. I get really good readings with this deck as well. So it's a very functional deck for me also in terms of just being a solid reader, but it definitely does help me kind of immerse into that fairy tale world. Next up, we have the Dame Darcy's Mermaid Tarot. This deck it really occupies a special place in my heart, which I think is really cool, and I do quite enjoy it. It's like stepping into a retro comic book version of The Little Mermaid, and I really enjoy that about it. And this deck and I have a really great relationship, and I really love the readings that I get with it. And it's just a lot of fun, and it's definitely one that I tend to pull out in the summer months because it just feels very summery to me. And of course, the other storybook deck that I have by Dame Darcy is the Queen Alice Tarot, and this is another treasured favorite deck in my collection. One of the things that I really like about this deck is that we kind of see the evolution of Alice from little girl to grown woman, and we see that throughout the cards. And so I think that's really fantastic. I really enjoy that about this deck, and it's just one that I love diving into. I love immersing myself into this world. Next up, we have the Crystal Unicorn Tarot. Now, I actually purchased this deck for my youngest because we had a Sweet 16 unicorn party. But this deck also reminds me of My Little Pony. I did the My Little Pony thing because that's when it first came out. And then my youngest did the My Little Pony thing when it kind of had its resurgence. And so it kind of has a special place for both of us in that sense. So another deck that I kind of wasn't sure where to put it is the Dreaming Way Tarot. Now, the name kind of suggests that it might be more of like that Dreamscape type of tarot deck. But what I find this deck feels like is kind of like stepping into a storybook. I adore the artwork in this deck. I've had this deck for quite some time and I have used it a ton. So the first deck that we're going to look at for fantasy-based is the Game of Thrones Tarot. I really adore this deck because, again, like sentimental reasons. This was a show that my husband and I watched together, and so it just makes me think of him every time I see this deck. As you can see, it's in order, and it's really not one that I read with very often. And it's one of the few decks that when I do read with it, I put it back because I like to store it that way. It is stored in its big old box and it sits on my shelf so that I can see it and think of him when I look at it. So another deck that is along those same fantasy lines is the Wizards Tarot. And this one, of course, is based on stories and movies and wizardy things, very magical worlds. We have reference to a lot of pop culture tie into Harry Potter, and we have cards that tie into the magicians. And I love to read fantasy and watch fantasy sci-fi type shows. And so this deck just kind of ticks that box for me. Here we have the Angel Tarot. It does have what I think of as like 90s fantasy. It has that look to me, and so that's the reason that I put it here, although it is technically an angel deck. But we have like dragons, and we have fairies, and we have mermaids. And one of the things that I like about this deck is the way the minors are presented. It's really the artwork that lends itself to being what I would consider a fantasy deck. And the artwork it's a little bit nostalgic for me as well, so I do quite enjoy it. Up next is the Crystal Visions Tarot. Now, I've done some serious modifications to this deck. I've actually painted it. It probably won't pick up on camera. This deck does read pretty sweet and almost like childlike and innocent for me, which I really do enjoy. And it was one of the first few decks I got when I started kind of collecting decks. And it was one of the first decks that I did this really heavy modification. So I definitely have a special place for it in my heart. Another Barbara Moore deck is the Steampunk Tarot. I've had this deck for a really long time. It is very well used, very well loved. I really love the steampunk vibe of this. It has a beautiful color palette. It's just, the artwork is stunningly rendered, and it's just a gorgeous deck. Of course, have a special place for it in my heart because once upon a time I only had 3 decks. I know it's hard to believe, but once upon a time I did only have 3 decks, and this was the 3rd one. So the next deck is the Fenestra Tarot, and this is the 2nd deck I ever purchased. So again, it's another one that I had for a really long time. I purchased this one because I was really looking for something that had a bit more feminine energy to it. And it has that kind of fantasy type of world, like feminine fantasy type of world to me. I think it's maybe the art style of the characters. It did work really well for that. I've kept it because, you know, sentimental reasons. And the last deck that we're going to take a look at is actually, ironically, my first deck, which is the Legacy of the Divine Tarot. I've told the story about this deck many times. It does have a very fantasy vibe to it. It's really not my art style, and it's really not something that I would probably purchase myself now, but it was what they said was new and hot, and they talked me into it, and I did use it exclusively for many, many years. So that was a look at my entire tarot deck collection as of March 2021. Thank you for joining me today. You'll find links for everything featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.